Dr. Blake, again, welcome to Constitutional Chats. Could you please give us a few opening comments on today's topic, and we will then go to questions.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. So, Americans like origin stories. We keep retelling how Batman became Batman, how Spider-Man became Spider-Man, and so on. And we also like our own origin stories. And usually we begin with the Pilgrims. They came across the ocean in the Mayflower, they settled Plymouth Rock, established a colony, struggled mightily for first winter, were helped by a Native American tribe with whom they formed an alliance, and had a Thanksgiving. And we love telling that story. And while that's an abridged version of it, it is an accurate version. And we also remind ourselves of why the Pilgrims came. They were seeking religious liberty. They were not just Puritans, they were separatists. They wanted their own congregations free from the Church of England at the time. So they braved the ocean, they braved establishing a new colony for that religious freedom. And then we find religious freedom, religion, and Providence continuing to play an important role in our nation's origin story. When we come to the founding of our country during the War for Independence, in the Declaration of Independence, there is that reference to God, saying that the laws of nature and of nature's God are on the side of the colonists, and a justification for seeking independence from Great Britain. And then again, we have images from that period. George Washington praying in the snow at Valley Forge. Benjamin Franklin suggesting the Constitutional Convention is struggling to reach agreement, that each session open with a prayer. And then, of course, John Adams' comment that our government, our Constitution, is fit for a religious and moral people. It is unfit to govern any other. So we see that religion is a consistent theme throughout our origin story, throughout the founding of our country, from our colonial origins up through the establishment of the government that we still live under. And you can trace it much beyond that through the abolition movement, through the civil rights movement. But this religious heritage, and in particular the Judeo-Christian heritage, has been a constant theme and part of our country since before we were a country, back when it was just a few colonists clinging to the border of what is now our nation.
Well, that's great. And thank you so much for that overview. Love those quotes. I know John Adams is one of Janine's favorite founders. And Janine, would you like to start with some questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that opening. And so I'm looking at the word providence, and it says the protective care of God or of nature as a spiritual power. So let's delve into John Adams' quote. When he said that the Republic was fit for, certain people who, in essence, believed in God. Can you flesh that out a little bit? Because it says, and then, and it's not made for people that are not. Delve into that a little bit for us. What do you think exactly that he meant? What does he mean by that?
That's a good question. So I think you can look at it in a few ways, but one way that I would highlight is that self-government requires a certain type of people. And self-government means that we can restrain our impulses, we can restrain our passions, and that we can be aware of our own tendency towards sin, as Christians would call it, towards lower, baser deeds, as you might put it in a more generic way. And the founders, all of them, were very cognizant and aware of this. Even the ones who were less personally devout were still very concerned with how do you make a people fit to govern themselves And what are the prerequisites for that? Because our Constitution presumes a self-governing people, yet, and in a way, our Constitution actually represents and is the soul of the self-governing person. Our Constitution too presumes that we must check and balance the lower impulses in the hope that the higher ones will win out. That is why we have these divisions of power. That is why even within Congress, we have a House and a Senate. That is why we have various procedural forms. And if looking at the Federalist Papers, which are the greatest explanation of our Constitution, drafted at the time it was being ratified and defending it, all of these were done with this recognition that human beings are flawed, we are fallible, we are sinful, we are prone to be short-sighted and selfish, and that therefore we need both a government system that will try to account for this and restrain us and force us to think through what we do in government, to compromise in government, but also that as a basis for that is a people who are aware of their own tendency to do evil, their own tendency to be selfish. And at the time of the founding, it was presumed that religion had an essential role in both teaching us of our own shortcomings and then helping us overcome them.
Well said. As you're talking, it's reminding me of course, James Madison in Federalist, I believe it's 51, where he says men are not angels. So that's what they were very concerned about, was we're good, but we have tendencies because we're human to want to fall into the negative characteristics that you just mentioned, including power and tyranny and things of that nature. If we juxtaposition a Republican form of government based on the theory that that men are not angels, just to simplify it, with communism that believed people, wasn't that more like Rousseau? People are actually good, and it's those nasty legislators and aristocrats and one percenters, so to speak, that are our problem. If we just get rid of those, then the inherent goodness of people will reign without constraint. And that was the problem of communism. Isn't that one of the juxtapositions there?
Yes, I think I've got my collection of books by Rousseau behind my shoulder here. But yes, his argument, and he wrote a few decades before the American founding. He was a French philosopher and writer. But his argument was that people are, as he said, basically good, and the problem is that society corrupts us. And something that, well, 2 points. One, as you say, communism, the intellectual heritage of that has some roots in Rousseau, and it does again presume people are fundamentally good, but society is corrupt. The economic superstructure is degrading, alienating, and so on. So if we can simply abolish it, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the state withers away, and we'll have this glorious communist system. And it has never worked that way. And then perhaps more relevant to the immediate question of the American founding, contrasting the American founding with the French Revolution, which took place shortly thereafter and ended badly. The French Revolution was much more Rousseauistic, had much less regard for the need to restrain our fundamental tendency towards evil. And consequently, there was the Reign of Terror, in which tens of thousands were executed, often on very minimal charges. There was the genocide, the Vendée, which has not been given the attention it was due, but when there was a civil war in France, it turned genocidal as revolutionary armies killed tens of thousands of men, women, and children. And then, of course, in the end, you had Napoleon. I think there's a new film coming out about him. I'm not sure it'll be any good or not, but he's a dictator. So the chaos turns into dictatorship and war in Europe for another decade and a half. And it was horrible. And that's what happens when you start with the assumption that I'm good. And the problem is those other people, so I just need to get rid of them, and then the goodness of myself and people like me will flourish if we do not restrain ourselves. And that is completely alien to the understanding the founders had of human nature. They were much more cognizant of just how much moral effort, how much effort as a community, as a family, as a church goes into making people who are fit to be good citizens.
Really fascinating. So in other words, the Rousseau, the socialist, the communist, that whole aspect is, I may not be a good person, or the negativities of my nature isn't my fault, it's your fault.
That's a good way of summing it up. It's not my fault, it's the fault of somebody else.
Yeah, it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. Whereas our founding was based more on the fact that we're inherently always in need of a higher power because we are not angels, and we need I think our founding fathers, in essence, were really aware of the shortcomings of human nature.
Yes.
So we needed to curb that, and we created a study last year on American exceptionalism, but based on how, due to our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Federalist Papers, we, as of yet, have not fallen into Greece, Rome, Hitler, Napoleon, Stalin, you name it, Mao, because we've had these checks on our inherently fallible nature. That's pretty impressive. And I think that with the mistakes that our country has made, and we've had many in our country, but the Declaration of Independence was our conscience. I heard that recently. Isn't that a great way of thinking about that? That it's our conscience, like that this is, we set forth the conscience of what we wanted to accomplish. And so we haven't always accomplished it, and it wasn't, but we've been stair-stepping to fulfill that great promise. What are your comments on that?
I feel like I've heard that before, but that's an interesting way of putting it. It certainly, it echoes Lincoln a bit, I think, or then Martin Luther King Jr., his comment about how the Declaration is a promissory note for all Americans. And I think, in a sense, that is true, but it also has to be then combined with our Constitution, which was based extensively on the experience of self-government that our founders had, where they did not simply say these are beautiful ideals. They put forth very concrete ways to try to realize them. And I think that combination is why we have had a pretty good run. Not perfect, as you said, but pretty good.
The 1-2 step, I call it. And in closing, I'll toss it off to Tova. It's like Abraham Lincoln talked about, that the Declaration of Independence is the golden apple, but the Constitution is the frame that upholds that apple. And so we have the Declaration, but the Constitution has protected us. I think that's exactly what you were just saying. Yes, is that what you were saying? The Constitution upholds the ideals. The checks and balances restraining the fallible nature of human vulnerabilities. The Constitution protects against that by the checks and balances. So it protects, like a frame protects the photo. It's protecting our conscience. I think we're saying exactly the same thing. We're just tossing it back and forth.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of agreement there.
Yeah. Okay, Tova, I'm going to toss it over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for being here and for giving that overview. You talked a bit about the founders sort of wanting the population to work on certain virtues so that we can self-govern. I was hoping you could talk a bit more about what that means. Like, what specific virtues did the founders have in mind that the population should have in order to be able to self-govern themselves?
I want to say all of them, but I think a few that stand out in particular to me are prudence, which, if you want to talk about it in sort of classical terms, is something that is imparted largely by experience. So you have Aristotle talking about the phronimos, or the spoudios. So you can, the mature man, the experienced man, the man of practical wisdom. So this suggests that virtue is something that is acquired through one's life, and that there are benefits to having experience. Now, part of what education seeks to do then is to impart these virtues, these lessons of experience, to those who may not yet have had those experiences, right? It's better to learn it from your teacher than to have to learn it painfully in the school of hard knocks. So prudence is essential. The importance of self-control is something that the founders stressed. The desire, or the ability to restrain your desires, to not simply think in the short term. And then some things that are perhaps tangential or related to virtue that we may be forgetting now culturally a little more are the importance of family, the importance of community, the importance of religious community, so that people are not formed in isolation. Rather, they are formed by their parents, first of all, by their siblings, grandparents, their families, but then also by those people that they meet in church, in synagogue, in Little League sports coaches. All of those examples we use because they're true. Most of us can think of those people who have instructed us, and that's not a virtue per se, but that is something that the founders would have taken almost for granted, that you need these strong ties, these strong bonds with other people to instruct the young. And I feel like that is something that's been forgotten a little bit.
I see that. That makes a lot of sense. And then I was curious, we're talking about the principles of the founding of the US, which kind of implies that these principles that were really furthered by the founding fathers might have been a reaction to something, happening before it, or something happening in other countries. So could you kind of compare and contrast the founders' ideals of what American providence should be, as opposed to the idea of providence maybe in England or in other countries? Like what does providence, what are the other views of providence that the founding fathers might have disagreed or wrestled with?
So just give a history of the world, I guess. No, that's a great question. And I'm going to try to not go too long. So a few points. One, in America, it was largely a Protestant country at that time. There's a small Jewish population. There is a larger Catholic population, but that was regarded with suspicion by most of the Protestants. And then there was even conflict, and we can see this again going back to the Pilgrims, with the Church of England. Yes, there was the Episcopal Church, so the American branch of the Anglican Church, but Americans were often suspicious of that if they were Congregationalist, if they were Baptist. So one of the things that actually was a bit of a spark for the revolution for some people was fear that the Church of England would start sending bishops over to America. There was also the Quebec, which was taken by the British during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as we tend to refer to it in this country, was of course a Catholic enclave, and that was a source of tension. So the Protestant Catholic divide was much more pertinent at the time of the founding. And then also the Jewish tradition was only minimally present. Now later in the 1950s, in particular during the struggle with communism in the Soviet Union, there was much more recognition of a unified Judeo-Christian heritage, which is how we tend to talk about it today, in contrast to communism, in contrast to various postmodern ideologies. So some of the most obvious things that the founders might have contrasted their understanding with were ones that we would now actually incorporate within that broader American Judeo-Christian heritage. But a couple points of contrast. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but it's a great question, and it's one that I can try to go in a lot of directions. So there were the beginnings of what you might call Enlightenment rationalism. So you have, of course, Rousseau, who is sort of a counter-Enlightenment thinker, but not returning to Christianity in any way, rather sort of extending the Enlightenment in a sense. The Enlightenment emphasized science, reason, rationality in place of religious authority. Rousseau said, well, what about the authority of what I feel? Where does that come into play? So the founders, one, they were perhaps deists, some of them, certainly Jefferson, Franklin, at the same, possibly even Washington, although I think he was more Anglican in his, or Episcopalian in his sentiments. But one thing that would stand out then is the founders were not sort of pantheistic, where Rousseau tends that way at times. They were also believers in a personal providence, or at least a providence that concerned itself with the affairs of human beings. So they did not have the image of God as a watchmaker who winds up the universe and then just lets it go. They believed that God did care and would intervene. So even a lot of those founders who might not have been the most devout Christians still tended to speak in the language of a providential God. I mean, that the very word providence suggests that personal care for the world of humanity. I don't know if that answered your question. I hope it got a part.
No, it did. That was a very thorough and enlightening explanation. So thank you. And then another question I had was, you did a good overview of talking about how important Providence was to the founders at the time, but I was hoping you could talk about what the influence of Providence has been. Do you feel it's as important to us now? Like, what does Providence mean for our country now? How is that evident in the way we run things? And what's the, value of the idea of Providence, or has it changed at a time when many Americans are, choosing not to identify with religion? I think around 20% don't typically identify with a religion. So basically talking about the value and importance of Providence today and how that might have changed from the time of the founding.
That's another great question, and I think I can give a more concise answer. I think Providence remains hugely important in the American understanding of our nation and of the world, but I do think it is secularized, and ways you can see that, the most obvious would be people who speak in terms of the right side of history. People who identify themselves as progressives may have this as part of their background idea that humanity inevitably progresses towards something better. The idea that there's a right side of history, again, suggests that there is an end to which we are striving. So it has become somewhat secularized, but we can still see that playing out. The fear of being on that history will condemn you is kind of a irreligious version of the fear that God will condemn you. So I think it's still there. But it has changed.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it seems like that connects to your previous work. I was reading your bio on sort of symbols and stand-ins for what happens when we don't have religion in a society, what becomes important. So that was a very fascinating, and I'll now pass on to Jewel and Jordan.
Hello, this is such a great topic and learning so much already. It's interesting to hear these perspectives. I don't think it's talked about very much in Providence just as itself, but you find the word come up from our founders in so many different versions of their addresses and in different ways that the word is used. So we've learned a lot on this show. Last week it came up a little bit with the concept of rights in our Declaration of Independence, that there's a misconception that I think has allowed America to become very fractured in its culture. So we're generally taught that there's a separation of church and state as if it's a law. And we've learned that that's not a law. And in public schools, the government is presented really to be amoral, and it's really presented to be naturalistic and as if there is no absolute truth. But in the founding documents, we see explicit and implicit claims of foundational truths based in the reality of a Christian and Jewish God. So the founders established freedom of religion, but modern interpretation stretched it to mean you aren't free if school teaches our actual recognized truths that were present in our founding documents. So that is a big hurdle when you're thinking of Providence, that people my age and probably older, but my age and younger, it's hard to rectify those two ideas, because when you go back to the founders, you see these ideas everywhere. But school acts as if those things are a personal opinion and separated from government.
Okay. So I think we've got a little bit of lag here. So I'm.
Did you hear?
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just respond to that and hope that this is going through. So I think that what I would say is, yes, the idea of the wall of separation of church and state, it comes from a letter Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists. In contrast, the Constitution says Congress shall not establish a religion nor prohibit the free exercise of religion. So you cannot have a state church, but the question of how far Congress, or really, the government, can recognize religion is an open debate. So we have under God, one nation under God, shows up in various places, and some of that was then put into place again during the conflict with global communism to recognize the American reliance on God in an ecumenical, broad sense compared to the communist rejection of God entirely. But yes, you're right. The founders, again, it's in the Declaration of Independence. God is referenced. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a strongly sectarian establishment that is prohibited by the Constitution. But every system of government does have some underpinnings for what we actually believe to be right, to be true. And in our nation, those were derived from Christianity, from the Hebrew scriptures that are such an important part of Christianity, and of course are essential to the Jewish population in this country. And that has always been there. And it's difficult to separate out these ideas of human rights, human dignity, from the underpinnings of Christianity or the Jewish scriptures that is where our founders got these ideas to a large extent.
That was a really great answer, despite if there was any lag. Thank you. And I guess since we do have a little bit of time to say again, is that what do you think? I think that it's what you just said is very important, that the government is going to have underpinnings of some belief, whatever that belief is. And we need to recognize what our underpinnings of our government's beliefs were at the founding. And that doesn't mean that it ever takes away from anyone's free exercise of the religion that they feel in their heart, that they follow in their conscience. But yet doesn't mean that we are to ignore the underpinnings of our foundation, in our founding, and our constitutional founding. So before I pass to Jorn, how do you think is best to talk about that? Because I do think we can't understand our founding documents without kind of getting over that hurdle, or else we always have that fracture I mentioned first.
Well, I think what we're doing here is one way to talk about that. Just honestly, just trying to understand what the founders believed, what they were influenced by, and it wasn't just Christianity and that Judeo-Christian heritage, but it was certainly an essential part of it for them. So it's historical accuracy to a certain extent, in that we simply have to, if we are to talk honestly about the American founding, recognize the importance of religion, of religious ideas, and of ideas derived from religious ideas and doctrines and practices to our nation's history. And secondly, then getting back to the point of there are philosophical, metaphysical assumptions behind every government. We should discuss that honestly and not simply presume that irreligion is neutrality, or that a rejection of ideas that come from religion is neutrality. No, that is still taking a side. And we need to look at that honestly, and recognize just where America's ideas came from, where our founding came from, and then B, what those ideas were and how they then interact with the ideas that are being taught or promulgated in education, in culture, in government today.
Great answer, thanks. And Jordan, for the question.
Yeah, how are you today? I'm very much enjoying your wealth of knowledge. We talking about Providence, it makes me think a little bit about during America's growth, what stopped America from wanting to keep growing? You know, what stopped from wanting to conquer more? Because Providence, you can really, you can relate it to power, and words of that nature.
Right.
Divine right, yeah. So I'm just curious, why did America stop growing, stop wanting to?
That is an interesting question that I'm not sure I've thought about in those precise terms, but I'll try to answer that. First of all, to our north, Canada was under the protection of Great Britain. So that was resolved. The line between the real Northwest, where I grew up, Oregon, Washington, such, between that and Canada was settled and has remained stable. South, we did end up annexing parts of Mexico, but then we had a civil war, and that probably created disincentives to further expand southwards during that, as well as there are some natural barriers there. Westwards, we did expand all the way to the Pacific, and then bought Alaska off Russia in the deal the previous century. That's great. And then Hawaii. There was an imperialist phase in the United States in the early 20th century in particular. So we, involvement in the Philippines and such. But yes, it did sort of stop for pragmatic reasons. I also think in terms of, at a certain point, we felt like, well, these are our neighbors. They're Mexico and Canada. There are other countries. We're not going to, the idea of conquering Canada is just kind of weird. It might be the simplest way of putting it. Why would we conquer Canada? That it's maybe a joke, but there's not a whole lot of incentive. I think it's just a very alien idea. Instead, I think America's imperial energies ended up being directed elsewhere, dealing with the threat of communism during the Cold War. And then since then, there have been debates over how extensively America should be involved in foreign affairs elsewhere in the world. So I don't know if that quite answers it, or if it answers it with 5 different things. But it was a good question that I don't know that I'd thought of before.
You definitely answered it. It was helpful just to go through, every reason and see what we were really thinking about in those times and how war can really change. Civil War probably changed a lot of things in what we might have done. So it was very interesting. My second question is, Obviously you're thinking of Providence, you're thinking of God, you're thinking Providence comes from God. But with that thought, connecting that is when you've received that providence, there is a duty then to do well with it. Now it seems as though we have lost that duty to what we've been given through providence, and we've become in a way soulless. So I just wanted to know if you could dissect that a little bit for me and tell me your thoughts on that stance.
Well, I certainly think that the idea you expressed is one that would have been very prevalent, or at least very common, during the founding. The idea that America has been given its freedom and independence through God's design, and it then has a duty to fulfill. Ellis Sandos, I think he died a while ago, but he was a professor at Louisiana State University, put together a collection of the political sermons during the American founding. And these ideas of providence and duty are definitely intertwined in the thought of the American founding generation. And so you're absolutely right about that there was that perception. And I do think that has decreased, perhaps, or it has, returning to a previous point, perhaps become secularized in some ways, where America is perceived to have a duty, but to being on the right side of history, to human rights in general, or something, in a way that is perhaps, I think is actually disconnected from more specific ideas of providence, and again, particularly tied to that Judeo-Christian heritage.
So this program is it's for all ages, but we also try to gear certain things to students, and and talk about certain things that may help their understanding, or things that matter to them. And going back to a lot of the questions here in my first questions, I do wonder if any of the students think about their experience in public school and are still kind of confused. Because if our founders were here today and they heard of, that that a kid probably has got in trouble, that there's all these cases where a kid get in trouble for wearing a cross on a t-shirt, or writing Bible verses on a locker, or anything else like that in school, where there's been the faith of the students hurt, but also the understanding of what it means to be American hurt by this secularization, which obviously stands in direct opposition to providence. We don't want any students watching to go get in trouble. But is there anything you could say to put their mind maybe at peace with that? Yes, you should be able to express those things, because in our founding documents, that was protected. And certainly that was what our founders would have expected if they would have foreseen public schools. I'm sure they would have foreseen there being classes actually teaching on biblical principles.
Well, so on that very last bit, the public school system in New England was religious. The public school system in the United States was largely a Protestant Christian institution for most of our nation's history. To the extent that there would have been conflict where a student would have been in trouble for their religious views, it probably would have been because they were Catholic. Again, there's that Catholic Protestant tension for quite a bit of the earlier part of our nation's history. So that, historically, it was assumed that schools were sort of ecumenically Protestant Christian, and then sort of ecumenically Christian. And then with regard to the constitutional issues, yes, students have rights to free speech and religion in school. And in particular, the wearing of a religious symbol is something that is constitutionally protected. I know some great lawyers who take these cases, and it is unfortunate that we ever have to litigate over this. But court decisions have consistently found that students have religious freedom rights in school to read the Bible, to pray, to wear religious symbols, whether that is a Christian cross or a Jewish yarmulke or some other symbol, or even things that are Sikh turbans, Muslim headscarves, and so on. Students do not give up their religious freedom rights when they go to school.
Thanks for that great answer and giving us some of that, the information about New England school systems. And being Catholic, we definitely learn a little bit more about those things of the early colonies, of where different prejudices lied in the different established religions of the original colonies in the States. I think, so we have about 2 minutes till we normally pass up to the audience questions, but looks like there's a bunch, Kathy, so I can ask another one, or you can go to the audience questions.
We'll go to the audience questions, and then maybe we can come back to y'all and at the end, if we have a little bit of time. And Jewel and Jorn and Tova and Janine, thank you so much for your great questions. First, before we go to the audience questions, we want to give a shout out to our students who are in the audience with us today. We have Lisa Paget, Hope Mucklow, Maria Wright, Victoria Kirk, Cami Wanhouse, all have students watching, and we want to thank all our students for being on. If you're a student watching and we didn't mention you or your family's name, please type in the Q&A, and we'd love to give you a shout out. And we also want to give a shout out to our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV on 1060 on the radio dial. Our show airs on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to all of our KKVV listeners. Now, Dr. Blake, Sharon Tates asks if you would tell us a little bit about your Ethics and Public Policy Center and what exactly that organization does. And if I could add to that question, Aubrey, maybe you want to pull the website up as well, or we could drop it in the Q&A.
So the Ethics and Public Policy Center is a think tank, and what makes it distinct are, one, we are religious but ecumenical. We have Catholic scholars, Protestant scholars, and Jewish scholars, and we take religion seriously as important both to our nation's policy, the laws, the Constitution, all that we've been talking about, but also to our culture. So it is essential, we believe, to inform our current policy debates, our current cultural debates, with the wisdom that is found in the Jewish and Christian heritage that, as we've just been discussing, is so important to our nation's history, and we think still essential today.
Well, thank you very much. And then we have we just put the link actually to the Ethics and Public Policy website there in our Q&A, so all of our listeners can investigate it. And thank you for all the work that you do. We have a series of questions on natural law from Gary Porter, and he asked, and I'm just going to kind of put them all together as one question, but he asks, and maybe we could, just go through them, but what is your assessment of the health of natural law today? And how do we bring natural law back into the public square conversation? And then finally, Gary observes there's a strain of natural law theory which denies natural law is sourced in God, but rather it is simply inherent within human society. And how do you argue against that?
So a few things that I think will respond to that. On the last point, I would say it depends on whether you're arguing that natural law is sourced in God or whether God is necessary to know natural law. So I think people can, to some extent, apprehend the natural law without believing in God. That's sort of the argument for natural law, is that it has been placed within our nature that certain things are good, certain things are bad, and that we can understand this even without the special revelation of Scripture. That said, the traditional natural law view is that it is God as creator who has placed these things in our nature. So you would have a very sharp distinction there. And discussing in America the laws of nature and nature's God, again, that line in the Declaration places the sources of these laws in God himself. So as far as the state of natural law and understanding natural law in America today, I think it's mixed. On the one hand, a lot of people find it a strange and alien idea. They perhaps view it as something that's only Catholic. On the other hand, and this is something that I've seen at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where we have someone like Andrew Walker, who's a Baptist seminary professor, doing great work on the natural law in the Protestant tradition. Brad Littlejohn, another colleague of mine, again, bringing the Protestant tradition, and again, America was primarily a Protestant Christian nation, was rich in natural law. At the time of the founding, it was being mixed with other intellectual influences, but it was a very strong natural law ideal there. And it was only really in the last century that Protestants started to reject the natural law, in large part under the influence of Karl Barth, for various theological reasons. But there's been a recovery that I think, and again, this is within Christian and specifically Protestant circles in America, but there is a recovery of natural law theology and thinking that I think is encouraging if you believe that natural law is true, important, and it's looking at the world through the lens of natural law is an essential part of our American heritage and for the good of our nation.
Well, thank you. And then can you recommend some books covering American history from a providential viewpoint?
Ooh, I have a lot of books I want to recommend, but I don't know how many of them are from a directly providential viewpoint. One very good book that I reviewed is called They Knew They Were Pilgrims, and I'm forgetting the author's name. I believe it was Yale University Press put it out, but it was a very good account of the Pilgrims and then the other Massachusetts Bay colonies up through Prince Philip's War, and really did a good job, in my view, of linking the theological and ecclesiological commitments. So their view of God, their view of the congregation and the church of the Pilgrims and the other Puritans who settled that area, with the political forms that they took, with how their history developed there. That was a book that I would recommend.
And you say that They Knew They Were Pilgrims.
That is the title.
Okay.
And I'm blanking on the author's name right now. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. And Donna asks if you see any court cases on the horizon coming up within the Supreme Court that you think will be touching on religious liberty or religious freedom.
I am sure they are. I am not a litigator, so I do not track that closely. Some of my colleagues are, and they do some really great work on that. But I feel like I should be able to answer that question, but I can't right now.
No, we totally understand. And we do have about 2 minutes left. And I wanted to just go back to Janine and Jewel and Jorn and make sure that you all got your Tova, if you're still with us as well. If any of you have any final questions or parting words.
Just thank you so much for being on and for your time. And thank you everyone for watching. We do this every week, so spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much to our audience. And we invite everybody to join us next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about the principle of knowing classical history. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
day.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.